Hello and welcome to a rather special edition of the France 24 interview tonight. This is a special edition because we are at the Reporters Without Borders Awards, and our guest is the co-winner of the Nobel Peace Prize 2021. Dmitry Muratov is the director of Novaya Gazeta, the independent media that has now suspended operations in Russia. Thanks for being with us. During your Nobel speech, you said something that I and many journalists obviously found striking, because you said, I want journalists to die old. Now, can you really be a journalist in Russia today and die old?
Well, yes, today I gave a speech at the evening of Reporters Without Borders, who does a lot for our job. I quoted some figures. In the last 15 years, 1,200 of our colleagues were killed. How many murderers were found or retrieved? 1 out of 10. 9 murders out of 10 remain unsolved. It's one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. This is why I can say that my dream hasn't come true.
Now, you decided that you would stay in Russia despite the difficult situation, all the things that happened to your newspaper. We remember that someone threw paint with acetone or something else, was a bit mysterious, on you. Aren't you afraid of staying in Russia in light of the media situation?
My dear colleague, regarding what is happening in the combat area, where not only soldiers but thousands, tens of thousands of civilians are being killed, well, the dangers of journalism, I wouldn't like to overstate them. Regarding my choice, this is the choice of Novaya Gazeta. Part of the collective will leave the country and print the paper since Riga Lithuania from Berlin, Germany, while I and part of my editorial, which is my house, I will remain in Moscow. Like Klaus Mann said, a whole people cannot emigrate.
A few days ago, Ilya Yashin, a political opponent, was sentenced to 8.5 years in prison for disseminating false information, because in his YouTube channel he had denounced the murder of civilians in Bucha. I'm sure this was something that shocked you, and that leads you to say that you can't say anything anymore in Russia today.
Well, I can give you an example of a young girl called Anastasia who comes from Chemin, and it is forbidden in Russia to say the word war. In all the publication you have to say special military operation. So according to the jokes running today, currently it's to change the title of Tolstoy's novel, War and Peace, and replace the name war, or the word war, with 3 stars. And this young girl wrote in the snow, no to, she didn't write war, but she put 5 dots in the snow. And she was brought to court for incitement to discredit the Russian army. And she said, in court, she said, no, I didn't mean war, I meant a fish, and this is a dried fish. This is funny, but what is not funny is when Gorinov, a city councillor, refused to organize a contest of drawing for children, saying it's an honor to do that during the war. He was sentenced to 8 years in jail. 8 years. And because he refused to organize this contest. At the same time, you have the propaganda channels of television. Propagandists say in an interview that Ukrainian children who say that the Russians are occupiers, well, they should be drowned or burned alive in their houses. And those ones, despite of their fascist declaration statements, they are not sentenced to anything. This propagandist has not been brought to court, has just been suspended for some time. So there is a terrible propaganda that's influencing people. And on the other hand, other people are sentenced because they just say the word war.
Obviously, the question on everyone's lips in the Western world is how can the Russians not just watch and listen to this propaganda, but believe in it? And, well, we have to assume that a relatively large proportion of the Russians think the same thing as Vladimir Putin, that we need to exterminate the Nazis in Ukraine and that the right decision has been taken.
Thank you for this very interesting question, important question. Not very far from here, in The Hague, there is today the trial against Mr. Kabuga, who had created in Rwanda the Radio of the Thousand Hills, calling for the extermination of the Tutsi people. And people were getting up, taking arms, and killed Tutsis. And more Tutsis were killed in villages where the radio was received. And in those villages where you couldn't hear the radio, people were not killed. So everybody can be subjected to propaganda. Well, more concretely about Russia, I have read outcome of many sociological surveys. We made some surveys here, and among our readers, 86% of our readers are absolutely against the war and in favor of immediate negotiations. In Russia today, over half of the population, in spite of the propaganda, half of the population is in favor of a negotiation and to put an end to the war.
So does that mean that Vladimir Putin is in a much more fragile situation than he thinks? On the one hand, because despite the propaganda, things are not going as he planned in Ukraine, and because as the dead bodies are returning and mothers are claiming their children's bodies, his support might crumble little by little, and maybe Putin's regime is not as strong as he thinks and as many think.
Well, I'm reluctant to make a final statement, but I could say that according to the political analysts in Europe, according to which the regime is over, is not correct. According to my information, I have different informations. The elite around Putin are very united as well as by ideology, as by fear. They fear for themselves, for their family, and they are united by obligation. That was the first point. Second point, the regime of Putin, for many, has been created thanks to Europe, created by Europe. For instance, I met in Moscow many foreign affairs ministers of foreign countries who are coming with, in the one hand, flowers on the grave of Anna Politkovskaya, and on the other hand, they were signing an agreement on the delivery of gas. Putin understood fairly well that Europe would do nothing against him because many politicians in Europe were bought by the Russians, and some were part of the board of directors of Russian companies, former German chancellors, former members of the national assemblies of various countries joined the team of Putin. And until December 5, Europe went on paying 600-700 million euros a day for the gas and oil. So war was less expensive for Russia. From an economic point of view, there was a balance to go to war. Some other point, a propaganda needs a monopoly. About 290 media who were not linked to the states were closed down. Over 300 people were stated to be foreign agents or enemies of the people. The financial support of the media, which was not depending on the state, was absolutely stopped. Sorry for making a long answer, but it's very important. There was a very tragic rift in Russia between the young generation and the old generation. The young generation below 35, in its vast majority, is not in support of the war in Ukraine. They prefer having secure borders and regular values and be able to study abroad. The older generation, in its majority, conversely so, is in support of the war. There is a rift between the grandfathers, the older generation, and the grandchildren. Those who have no more futures are creating a very dire future for those who still have a future, and this is a tragedy.
And one last question, Mr. Muratov. Do you think that Vladimir Putin can still win this war by using the price of gas or perhaps the burden of Ukrainian refugee flows against Europeans? Because many think that Ukraine has resisted well and can and will win. But do you think that Putin can still win in the way I just described?
Well, Putin has tremendous resources. The first resource is the legacy of the Soviet Union, a tremendous amount of weapons dating back to the USSR, the weapons of the empire, while the European politicians remain at the helm for 2, 4, 6 years or 2 5-year terms. Conversely so, the time Putin can remain in power is unlimited. He has resources much more important than any political leader in Europe. Putin has been here for 23 years. How many presidents did you have in France? I think Putin cannot remember the names of all of them. So Putin has a resource, an important resource, energy, the support of part of the population, the fact that he was able to acquire technology and money from Europe. What Russia will not be able to do is, is as follows. It could destroy Ukraine, destroy the infrastructures, the power plants, the city, the buildings, but it will never be able to conquer it. It will never succeed.
Dmitry Muratov, thank you very much for answering France 24's questions, and thanks for watching.